In the flat, endless fields of southeastern Nebraska, where the corn grows so tall it swallows the sky, there is a farmhouse that has stood since the land was first broken. White paint long surrendered to gray, windows like empty eyes, it sits alone at the end of a dirt road no GPS will acknowledge. The people in town call it the Crawford place, and they say the name the way you say cancer, quick, quiet, and with a glance over the shoulder. 7 children have been born in that house since 1952. 7 children, 4 generations, 1 bloodline. And every single one of them came into the world already wounded. Behind the left ear, just where the skull curves down to meet the neck, there is a mark. Not a birthmark, not a bruise, but a scar. Thin, deliberate, shaped like a waning moon. Perfectly identical. Healed before the first breath, as if the cut was made somewhere else, someone else, and simply carried across. Doctors have measured it. Photographed it. Sent tissue samples to universities that never write back. The scar is always 31 millimeters long, 4 millimeters at its widest, edges beveled like something made with a scalpel held by a very steady hand. But the scar is only the beginning. Because every Crawford child, somewhere between the ages of 3 and 5, wakes in the night choking on the same words. They speak of a tall man in black with silver in his smile. They speak of corn that rustled like bones. They speak of a blade that felt cold and then felt like nothing at all. And when you ask them how they know these things, they look at you with eyes too old for their faces and say, because it happened to me. Before. Tonight, another child is coming. The midwife has already arrived, hands shaking though she won't say why. Outside, the wind is moving through the corn in waves, and somewhere in that darkness something is walking between the rows, counting. The moon is almost gone. And the Crawford line is not finished paying its debt. The year was 1957, and the hospital in Beatrice, Nebraska still smelled of bleach and cigarette smoke. Evelyn Crawford, 23 years old, pale from 9 months of morning sickness and a husband who'd been gone to Korea longer than he'd been home, lay on the delivery table with her legs in stirrups and her heart hammering against her ribs like it wanted out. The doctor was old school. Mask pulled down under his chin so he could chew on an unlit cigar while he worked. Nurses moved in practiced silence. Outside the window the sky was the color of dishwater, late October, the last of the corn harvest rattling in the wind. When the baby finally slid free with a thin, angry cry, Evelyn reached for him the way every mother does, desperate for that first touch, that first proof that the pain had purchased something perfect. The doctor lifted the boy, wiped him once with a rough towel, and paused. Just a heartbeat of hesitation, but Evelyn caught it. She saw the way his eyes narrowed behind the smudged glasses, the way his thick fingers brushed the tiny skull as if confirming what he thought he'd seen. Behind the left ear, hidden beneath a damp curl of dark hair, was a scar. It wasn't raw or fresh. It wasn't the kind of mark left by forceps or a difficult birth. It was pale, thin, already settled into the skin like it had been there for years. A perfect crescent, edges smooth and deliberate, the exact shape of a thumbnail moon the night before it disappears. The doctor turned the baby's head gently, angling him toward the harsh fluorescent light, and Evelyn felt the room tilt. Because she knew that scar. She had one just like it. She'd hidden it her whole life, parting her hair on the opposite side, letting it fall forward whenever anyone came too close. Her mother had told her it was nothing, just a birthmark that looked like a scratch, nothing to be ashamed of. But Evelyn had always felt the lie in it. Birthmarks didn't have edges that neat. Birthmarks didn't ache when thunderstorms rolled in from the west. Birthmarks didn't make her wake up at 4 years old tasting blood and hearing a man laugh somewhere far away in the dark. The doctor cleared his throat, handed the baby to the nurse, and said nothing at all. But Evelyn saw him glance at her, quick and sharp, like he was trying to match the mother to the wound. The nurse wrapped her son in a blanket, cooing the usual soft nonsense, and laid him in Evelyn's trembling arms. She turned his head herself then, pushed aside the damp hair with a finger that wouldn't stop shaking, and stared at the impossible. Her boy was less than 10 minutes old, and someone, somewhere, had already cut him. The house was too quiet that night, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums like water. Evelyn had finally fallen asleep on the couch with the baby monitor crackling beside her ear, the way new mothers do when exhaustion wins over fear. Upstairs, Tommy, 4 years and 3 days old, slept in the small room under the eaves, surrounded by wallpaper printed with faded circus trains. At 2:17 a.m. the screaming started. It wasn't the thin wail of a child who's fallen out of bed or seen a shadow that looked like a monster. It was deeper, raw, the sound of something being torn open. Evelyn was up the stairs before she was fully awake, bare feet slapping cold wood, heart slamming so hard she tasted iron. She threw open the door and Tommy was sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes wide and fixed on nothing, mouth stretched in a perfect O. He was choking on words that shouldn't fit in a child's throat. "The man with the silver teeth," he rasped, voice shredded, "he cut me when the corn was high." Evelyn reached him in 2 strides, gathered him against her chest, felt his small body rigid as fence wire. His skin burned. His hair was soaked with sweat. She tried to shush him the way she shushed nightmares about wolves or falling, but he wouldn't come back to her. He kept staring past her shoulder at the dark window where the moon hung low and sickly over the fields. "He grabbed me here," Tommy said, and his tiny hand flew to the spot behind his left ear, fingers digging at the scar as if he could claw it out. "Said I had to remember. Said the mark means I belong to him." Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She had never told anyone what she sometimes dreamed, never told her mother, her husband, the priest at confession. She had never spoken the words corn was high out loud in her entire life. They lived inside her like a splinter too deep to dig out, surfacing only in sleep, always paired with the glint of something metallic between a stranger's teeth and the wet heat of her own blood running down her neck. Tommy's eyes rolled back. His body jerked once, twice, then went limp. For one terrifying second she thought he'd stopped breathing. But he hadn't. He was only somewhere else, lips moving soundlessly, repeating the same phrase over and over, so low she had to lean in until she felt his fevered breath on her cheek. "You'll come back marked," he whispered, "so I'll always find you." Somewhere outside, the corn shifted though there was no wind at all years later, after Tommy's night terrors had faded into sullen silences and Evelyn had learned to sleep with one hand on the shotgun under the bed, she began pulling the old albums down from the closet shelf. She told herself it was just spring cleaning, nothing more. The house was too full of babies now, Tommy, then Sarah, then the twins, and the shelves groaned under the weight of everything the Crawfords refused to throw away. The albums were heavy, bound in cracked leather that smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. Most of the photographs were sepia or black and white, edges scalloped, corners curling like dead leaves. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table long after the children were asleep, a cigarette burning forgotten between her fingers, turning pages she hadn't opened since her own childhood. She found her father first. A studio portrait taken in 1931, age 6 months, propped against a velvet pillow. The photographer had combed the thin baby hair forward, but not carefully enough. There it was, behind the left ear, the crescent scar, pale against new skin, unmistakable even in the soft focus of 70-year-old film. She turned another page and her breath caught. Great-Aunt Clara, 1912, posed on the lap of a stern woman in bombazine. Clara's head was tilted just so, ringlets brushed aside, the scar stark as a brand. Then Uncle Roy, 1924, grinning in a sailor suit on the front porch, one small hand raised to scratch his head and revealing the mark like a secret he didn't yet know he carried. Page after page, generation after generation, every Crawford infant caught at the exact same angle, as if the photographers themselves had been compelled to document the proof. Evelyn's hands began to shake so badly the album pages rattled. She went to the hallway mirror, lifted her own hair, and stared at the reflection of the scar she'd hidden beneath curls and lies for 30 years. Then she walked upstairs on legs that didn't feel like hers, eased open the nursery door, and stood over the crib where baby Sarah slept on her side, thumb in mouth, blanket kicked to the foot. Moonlight from the window painted the room silver. Sarah's fine hair had slipped away from the spot Evelyn already knew too well. The crescent was there, perfect, healed, waiting. She closed the door without a sound and went back downstairs. The albums lay open like autopsy reports, a silent parade of marked children stretching back to a tintype dated 1895, a solemn baby boy with eyes too knowing and the scar already carved behind his ear. Evelyn poured herself 3 fingers of bourbon she didn't taste and stared at the photographs until the faces blurred together into one long, unbroken line of wounded innocence. Outside, the corn stood motionless under a sky without stars, listening. By 1978, the house held too many secrets and not enough sleep. Tommy was 21, home from Lincoln with a psychology degree he didn't believe in and a restlessness that made him pace the porch at night like a dog smelling blood. Sarah was 17, angry at everything, especially the scar she now outlined with black eyeliner to make it look deliberate. The twins, 15, had begun finishing each other's sentences in a way that chilled even their mother. Evelyn found the hypnotist through a classified ad in the back of a magazine she pretended not to read. Dr. Langenkamp worked out of a narrow storefront between a pawn shop and a laundromat in Omaha, his waiting room smelling of patchouli and old grief. He had soft hands, a voice like warm oil, and eyes that didn't blink often enough. They went one at a time, then all four together when the separate sessions produced the same impossible footage. Under the low amber lamp, Tommy went first. His head fell forward, chin to chest, and the words came out flat, stripped of childhood terror, as if he were reading from a script etched on the inside of his skull. August 19, 1894. Moon 3 days from dark. The corn was higher than a man's head, thick enough to hide screaming. The man wore a black coat and a preacher's collar gone grey with road dust. His teeth flashed silver when he smiled, coins hammered flat and fused into the enamel after some earlier fire. He dragged the boy, no older than 10, by the hair to the edge of the field where the irrigation ditch ran red with runoff. The blade was a barber's straight razor, long and singing. One cut, quick, behind the left ear, deep enough to promise death but not deliver it yet. "You'll carry my mark," the preacher said, voice soft as prayer. "Every time you come back, I'll know you. And I'll finish what I started." Sarah went next. Same field, same moon, same razor. The twins followed, speaking in eerie unison, describing the smell of coal oil on the preacher's coat, the way the corn leaves sliced their bare arms as they ran and were caught again. When Dr. Langenkamp played the tapes back in the cramped office, the four Crawford siblings sat pale and silent while their own voices filled the room with a single, overlapping memory. None of them had lived in this life. The doctor's hands shook as he stopped the recorder. Outside, a sudden wind rattled the plate glass window hard enough to make the bell chime, though no one had opened the door. In the parking lot afterward, none of them spoke until Tommy lit a cigarette with fingers that wouldn't stay still. "He's still waiting," he said, exhaling smoke into the cold Nebraska night. "Out there in the rows." The sheriff's name was Delmar Haas, 62 years old. 29 of them spent pretending nothing truly evil ever took root in Gage County. He came to the Crawford place on a Tuesday in early March 1981 because Sarah had marched into his office with a cassette tape and eyes that dared him to laugh. He didn't laugh. He took the tape, listened to it twice in his cruiser with the windows rolled up, then drove out to the farmhouse himself, hat in hand like a man attending a funeral he hadn't been invited to. 2 days later he was back, this time with a warrant folded in his pocket and a county backhoe idling on the road. He had spent 36 hours in the basement of the courthouse, pulling records nobody had touched since Roosevelt's first term. August 1894, a traveling revival preacher named Elias Crow reported missing after preaching hellfire at a tent meeting 3 miles from the Crawford land. Last seen walking south along the irrigation ditch with a 10-year-old boy whose name had never been recorded. The preacher's body was found 6 weeks later by a farmer's dog, half buried under corn stubble, throat cut so deep the head stayed on by gristle alone. Behind the left ear, the coroner noted, a deliberate crescent slice taken clean out of the flesh, as though someone wanted to mark the corpse for later. But it was the mouth that stopped Haas cold. The preacher's teeth had melted in a fire years earlier, some earlier crime or accident no one remembered, and he had replaced them with silver dollars hammered flat and riveted into the gums. The coins were still there, fused black by heat and time, glinting between shredded lips when the skull finally saw daylight again. Haas stood at the edge of the field while the backhoe scooped frozen earth, his breath fogging in the cold. The ditch had been filled in decades ago, rerouted when the Crawfords bought the adjoining quarter section in 1895, the same year their bank account suddenly grew fat enough to buy out 3 failing neighbors. The machine's bucket clanged against something solid. Bones came up wrapped in scraps of black broadcloth, a rotted leather Bible still clutched to the ribcage with finger bones that had fused into a claw. When they turned the skull toward the weak afternoon sun, The empty eye sockets looked straight at the Crawford farmhouse half a mile away, and the silver teeth caught what little light there was like a signal meant for someone still living. Haas lit a cigarette he didn't taste and watched the forensic tech lift the skull into an evidence bag. The wind came up sharp from the west, rattling the dead corn stubble in perfect rows, and for just a second the sheriff could have sworn he heard a low, satisfied laugh carried on it. The envelope arrived in June 1993, plain Manila, no return address, postmarked Baltimore. Inside were 6 pages of lab letterhead from the Johns Hopkins Center for Inherited Disease and a cover note that simply read, "You were right to ask. Do not contact us again." Evelyn opened it alone in the kitchen while the coffee went cold, the house quiet for once because every child old enough to drive had scattered to summer jobs and city apartments, trying to outrun what they carried. The results were impossible. They had taken buccal swabs from Tommy, Sarah, the twins, and little Grace, who was only 8 and still believed the scar was a fairy kiss. They had compared them to Evelyn and her husband Ray, both of whom carried ordinary Midwestern genomes laced with nothing more exotic than a tendency toward early baldness and bad knees. The children, however, shared a sequence on chromosome 17 that should not have existed at all, a string of 4,200 base pairs that appeared in every Crawford child with the scar and in none of their parents. The mutation was too long, too precise, to be random. The Hopkins team called it an orphan insertion, a chunk of DNA that belonged to no known human lineage, no primate, no anything catalogued in GenBank. It sat there like a foreign book slipped between familiar pages, and it glowed under certain probes the way deep-sea creatures glow. The scar itself had been biopsied years earlier. Grace's had been the easiest because she was still small enough to bribe with ice cream. The tissue was mature scar collagen, laid down months, perhaps years, before birth. The cells in that crescent carried the exact same impossible sequence, only there it was expressed, switched on, while in the rest of the children's bodies it lay dormant. The report used the phrase epigenetic branding 3 times, then crossed it out and replaced it with careful synonyms, as if the words themselves were dangerous. Evelyn read the final paragraph 4 times before the paper slipped from her fingers. The insertion contains a non-coding region that matches, nucleotide for nucleotide, a sequence recovered from the 1894 skeletal remains exhumed in Gage County, Nebraska, sample NE-CRO-01. Probability of coincidental identity, 10 squared cubed. We recommend no further testing. She walked to the hallway mirror, lifted her hair, and looked at the scar she had stopped hiding years ago. Then she looked at the framed school photos lining the staircase, every child smiling for the camera, heads tilted just enough to keep the left ear out of frame. The same foreign signature lived in all of them, passed down like a dowry, only it had not come from her body or Ray's. It had come from somewhere else, slipped into the bloodline the way a cuckoo lays an egg in another bird's nest. Outside, the corn was already knee-high and whispering. Grace was 3 years and 4 months old the morning she climbed onto the kitchen table with a stub of red crayon and a sheet of butcher paper Evelyn used for grocery lists. The house was still asleep upstairs. The twins had come home drunk from a graduation party. Sarah was on night shift at the hospital. Tommy lived in Denver now and never called. Only the old clock ticked and the refrigerator hummed while Grace worked in total silence, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth the way it always did when she concentrated. Evelyn found her 20 minutes later, barefoot in her nightgown, surrounded by a snowstorm of crayon shavings. The drawing covered the entire sheet, a tall man made of black scribbles, no face except a wide slash of silver where the mouth should be. The coat reached the ground. The hands were too long. Corn rose on both sides like prison bars, each stalk drawn with obsessive care, the tassels dripping red. At the man's feet lay a small figure with yellow hair and one arm reaching up, a perfect crescent carved behind its ear in violent crimson strokes. Grace never looked up when Evelyn's shadow fell across the table. She only pushed the paper forward with both hands, solemn as a priest offering communion. "That's him," she said, voice small but steady. "He waits in the high part." Evelyn's knees buckled. She caught the table edge to keep from falling. The face, if the silver gash could be called a face, was unmistakable. She had seen it in her own nightmares, in Tommy's regression tapes, in the police photographs of a skull with coins for teeth. But Grace had never been told. She had never heard the name Elias Crow, never seen the composite sketch the sheriff kept locked in a drawer. She was 3. She still believed thunder was God moving furniture. At the bottom of the page, in shaky capital letters that should have been impossible for fingers that small, Grace had written a single word. Crow. The crayon rolled off the table and clattered on the linoleum like a gunshot. Grace finally lifted her head, eyes the pale grey all Crawford children shared, and smiled the way children do when they've finished a chore they were born to do. He says the last one's coming soon, she whispered, touching the scar behind her ear with sticky red fingers. And this time he gets to keep what he started. Outside the window, the corn bent all at once though the morning was perfectly still. The nursing home in Wymore smelled of boiled cabbage and pine cleaner, the kind of place where the walls themselves seemed tired. Aunt Lydia was 97, a stick figure under pink blankets, oxygen hissing through the cannula taped beneath her nose. Her eyes were milky, but they sharpened the moment Evelyn sat down and took her bony hand. "I knew one of you would come," Lydia rasped, voice like paper tearing. "Been waiting since the last full moon." Evelyn had driven 4 hours with the Hopkins report folded in her purse and Grace's red crayon drawing burning a hole in the glove box. She didn't waste time on greetings. "Tell me about 1894, she said. Lydia's laugh cracked like ice on a puddle. "Your great-granddaddy Silas was a hard man. Mean drunk, worse sober. Farm was failing, bank fixing to take everything. Then one August night he came home before dawn, boots soaked red to the ankle, pockets heavy with silver dollars still hot from a fire. Said he'd met a preacher on the road who'd made him an offer too good to refuse." She turned her head on the pillow, the crescent scar stark against translucent skin even now, though the hair that once hid it had fallen out years ago. "Silas killed him in the corn. Cut behind the ear first so the devil would know his own when they came back. Took the money melted into the man's mouth, pried it out with a fence tool while the body cooled. Buried what was left under the ditch and planted over it the next spring. Corn grew taller than ever that year. Blood's good fertilizer." Evelyn's mouth went dry. "He sold us." "He sold all of us," Lydia corrected. "Every child born after would carry the mark so the preacher could find his thief again and again till the debt was square. Silas thought dying would end it. Didn't know dying was just the first payment." Her fingers clamped around Evelyn's wrist with impossible strength. "I felt him walking the rows every harvest my whole life. Heard him counting. He's close now, Evie. Closer than he's ever been. The interest's come due." A nurse appeared in the doorway, startled by the heart monitor's sudden frantic beeping. Lydia's grip loosened. Her eyes rolled white. "Tell the young ones to burn the fields," she whispered as the alarms began to scream. "Burn it all before the last baby comes." Then her hand fell limp, the scar on her neck suddenly dark, as though fresh blood had welled beneath the skin one final time. The storm rolled in just after midnight on the last day of July 2001, a black wall of cloud that swallowed the moon and turned the cornfields into an ocean of slashing leaves. Lightning strobed white, thunder followed so close it felt like artillery. Evelyn had gathered every Crawford still willing to come home, Tommy from Denver, Sarah from Lincoln, the twins from wherever they'd been hiding, and Grace, now 11, silent and watchful, into the old parlor with its horsehair furniture and peeling wallpaper. The windows rattled in their frames, rain lashed the glass like thrown gravel. They sat in a loose circle under the weak glow of a single hurricane lamp because the power had died with the first thunderclap. No one spoke. They had all felt it building for weeks, pressure behind the eyes, the scar itching like a healing burn, dreams that left them waking with dirt under their fingernails though none of them had walked outside. At 1:13 a.m. Grace stood up first. Her mouth opened, but the voice that came out was not hers. It was deeper, male, threaded with a cadence older than any church in Nebraska. "Kyrie eleison," it said, slow and deliberate, the Latin perfect. "Miserere nobis." Tommy jerked upright next, eyes wide and unseeing. The same words rolled from his tongue in the same unnatural baritone. Then Sarah. Then both twins at once, voices overlapping, layering, filling the room until the air itself seemed to thicken. Grace's small hands rose, palms forward as though pressing against an invisible wall, and the others mirrored her without thinking. 5 scarred Crawfords standing in perfect synchronization, reciting a prayer none of them had ever been taught. Evelyn backed against the wall, heart hammering so hard she thought it would split. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breath plumed white. The lamp flame stretched tall and blue, guttered, then steadied again. Outside, the wind died as suddenly as if someone had closed a door. The prayer rose in volume, no longer Latin but something older, guttural, syllables that hurt to hear. The scar behind every left ear began to glow faintly, a dull red like embers under ash. Grace, or whatever wore Grace, tilted her head and smiled with a mouth too wide. Redite quod debitis, the 5 voices said together. Give back what is owed. Lightning struck the yard so close the flash bleached the room white, and for one frozen second Evelyn saw him standing between the thunder and the window, tall black coat whipping though there was no wind anymore, silver teeth catching the glare like a predator's grin. Then darkness rushed back in, absolute and hungry. The prayer stopped mid-word. 5 bodies dropped to the rug as though strings had been cut. The lamp went out. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the soft, wet patter of blood hitting hardwood from 5 identical crescent wounds that had opened behind 5 left ears at exactly the same moment. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on All Saints' Day, 2002. Sarah's water had broken in the ambulance halfway from Lincoln, and the driver refused to turn back when she started screaming that it was too soon, too wrong. They carried her into the old house because it was closer than any hospital, laid her on the same iron bed where Evelyn had birthed every Crawford child since 1957. The midwife, a woman who had delivered half the county and never flinched, took one look between Sarah's legs and crossed herself. The baby crowned already scarred. Not a birthmark, not a bruise, but an open wound, the crescent edges rolled back like petals, blood pulsing in perfect rhythm with Sarah's contractions. The midwife tried to clamp it, to press gauze, but the cut refused to close. It simply bled, steady and calm, as if the child were being drained before it had even taken a breath. Tommy held Sarah's hand. Grace stood in the doorway, 11 years old and ancient, eyes reflecting lamplight like a cat's. Evelyn knelt at the foot of the bed, whispering every prayer she could remember and some she invented on the spot. When the head finally emerged, the room went still. The wound was deeper than any scalpel could reach without killing. Bone showed white beneath the raw edges, yet the infant did not cry. It opened storm-grey eyes, looked once around the circle of terrified faces, and smiled with a mouth that held the shadow of silver. Sarah bore down one final time, and the child slid free into the midwife's trembling hands. A girl. Placenta followed, black and thick as tar. The cord did not pulse, it lay limp, already dead. But the baby breathed. She breathed, and the crescent gaped wider, and the blood that poured from it was not bright red but dark, almost black, carrying flecks of something metallic that caught the lamplight like mica. The midwife tried to tie the cord, but the baby lifted one tiny fist and pressed it to the wound. The bleeding slowed, then stopped entirely, edges knitting together before their eyes until only the familiar pale scar remained, perfect and healed as every Crawford scar had ever been. Except now it was different. When the newborn opened her mouth to cry at last, the sound that came out was not a wail. It was a name. Silas, she said, clear as a church bell, voice layered with something that had waited 108 years to speak through fresh lungs. Outside, the cornfields, every stalk, every leaf, bent flat to the ground as though a great hand had swept across them. The wind that followed carried the smell of turned earth and old blood, and somewhere deep in the rows a low, satisfied laughter finally faded into silence.